Hello, take two. Yeah, you'll never see the take one, unfortunately. Anyway, so hello. It's weird because as I one of the reasons I messed up on the take one is because I didn't have anything to talk about. So I guess I'm going to talk about we're trying to get like pseudo deep. I mean, I say pseudo deep because I not for myself. Like, in other words, like, I don't know that I have like particularly deep thoughts. I think it's interesting, but I think that that's always sort of like there's this perception, right? So of like, oh, you're doing well. So let's talk about that first. So let's talk about before we talk about that, let's talk about the first thing I want to talk about. So one of the things that's interesting about me in particular, right? And this is presumably a feature of personality. It's probably, it's hard for me to see it as a positive. It's interesting because I had a nightmare last night, and I was sort of thinking about how this could really be a negative, right? The world is a certain way. I hope, you sort of hope that there's like, I don't know, but let me before I get into sort of my reaction to what I'm thinking about, let me describe what I think one of the sort of goals of this video, right? Like the whole goals of 511 thoughts, etc., was to really present a very raw video, right? And raw in the sense that it's sort of like all it has, it has literally just my sort of, reflections. I like this. I think reflections is an accurate word because when you talk about reflections, you're not talking about per se, you're not, reflections does not equal thoughts, right? It really is sort of like, this happened to me, I'm going to reflect over it, and it has it has some indication that you're not necessarily like putting a logical structure into it. You're kind of just sort of saying, how did I feel about this? Like, what happened? How do I feel about this? What do I think? What do I think in a very colloquial term? So, but that was sort of what I wanted to do here, right? Like, that was if this had a theme. And we're still, remember, did we say we had to get to 250? We're not even out of the 50s yet. So we're literally a fifth of the way through. So this is like how far we've come, like 20%, right? I'm getting that, the 20% early. No, I'm just kidding. But it's interesting because like, and there's this idea, right? Like, there's this idea that like, this was what it was supposed to be. So there's an understanding that if I really truly wanted to, perhaps I could have found a way to make these, make videos in a different way, right? But I wanted to do the sort of vlog style, etc. And what I'm trying to say is that I think that this indicates something about me in particular, right? More than anything else, right? We talk about sort of studying personality on a sort of mechanistic way. I've mentioned the term like, sort of process versus result type of person, etc., etc. But I think at my core, right, one of the things that I'm trying to get to in any way I can is to sort of have an understanding of the world that is sort of transparent, right? So the idea of transparency, like the idea of, believe it or not, I like the game of poker, but I think, the game of poker, you really have to, the goal is to sort of trick your opponents, right? And I think most games are like tricks. I think I enjoyed poker because I didn't play, for high stakes, so I didn't, there was probably no incentive to trick me. And also, I think there's also a, I think there's more to it than pure trickery. It's interesting, but I think that is sort of how the games work, right? And maybe sort of guessing somebody's trickery. Anyway, my point is to say that like this is sort of who I am, right? Like, I am someone who just is, the word naive is not necessarily used for me, but I think, in other words, like, I never really had somebody tell me I'm naive. Maybe I think somebody's mentioned I was gullible before. It's interesting, right? The word gullible. But no one's ever told me that I was like, sort of like, so naive or so gullible that like that was the mark of myself. But I do believe that for me, like I'm all about sort of like what is the real truth, right? like this idea of like sort of keeping it real, right? And the problem, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but the problem with keeping it real, obviously, is that I don't think we're incentivized to actually sort of like not keep it real, because that's how you sort of maintain an advantage over people. And I think for me, it's like really hard to sort of maintain an advantage over people, because I just come at you like, for me, it's like, it's hard, like I'm sure I've talked about this before. Like, one of my problems in life is that I can be both too trusting, but more importantly, like too nice, right? Like, I don't really have any incentive, like I don't really have any reason to sort of like try to like not like you. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's so weird. And I don't know if like people like, cause I was thinking, like I said, last night I had a nightmare about sort of this idea that like the world is like whatever, and it's all about sort of like, you're basically like, you're a fish, you're swimming in water, and it's like, well, your number one goal is to not be eaten, right? And we sort of talk about that, and then we talk about like the other things, right? And so it's interesting, because I think as I come out with this like sort of, fresh, I just took a shower. My point about the fresh face is that there's sort of nothing, it's raw, right? And that was by design. I think that's, in my opinion, like I like that, but that's sort of probably my personality, right? Like, I like being sort of raw, and I don't know that, and I think the problem is that like, I think a lot of people are, at least in my nightmare, people were like, well, not only are you not supposed to be raw, but like, we really don't like you if you're raw, because like, it's like, you gotta be sort of, it's uninteresting. I mean, I can get it's kind of uninteresting, but at the same time, it is me. And I guess like, I forgot my other point that I was going to go into, but I think one of the interesting things is that there's sort of this pressure to, put on masks or not be yourself. And like I said, for me, I don't really have an agenda other than the agenda of, a Barney theme song or something. I'm just kidding. But the point is that like, it's interesting because like, people, it's sort of like you feel, if people don't like that about you, then you feel like you need to change, right? Like, it's like, well, you're some, whatever, good luck getting people to like you. And it's like, well, you know what? This is me. And I think, to me, like a strength in life, aside from sort of, like I said, you don't want to grovel to people. You don't want to, you never want, I agree. Like, I don't want to be weak. I don't necessarily think I'm weak. I think I get sometimes I get like offended by, whatever. But I think the point is to say that like, being strong is being true to yourself, right? And if you're if you like, our conception of ourselves is a question for, philosophy and science, in that order probably. But it's a question, it's interesting question of sort of like, what is the conception of self, right? But when we behave, right, when we sort of interact with the world, it is sort of like, this is who I am, right? Like, maybe I'm not, in other words, like, this is what I'm honestly thinking at this given moment, right? And it's sort of like, whatever sort of, whatever stage I'm on, talking to this video, it is sort of pure. And this is an interesting question. But anyway, but all of this to say, the point there is that I think one of the people I most respect online, had an interesting tweet about, you really have to be yourself. And I believe that. And, that person that I respect, I think one of the reasons why I respect that person so much is because they do stand up for the idea of being yourself in a world where, yourself might not be popular. And the problem is, too, is that not only yourself might be popular, but sometimes it might be dangerous to be yourself, But it's like, you have to do not only what you believe, but what you, sincerely want to do in life, and try to figure that out, right? And so that's interesting, right? But I think, where was I was going to say something else. So it's interesting because like, what else was I finished that thought, and then I was going to, because it is always this sort of battle. And, I know what I was going to say. So who we are, right? Like, so the question, it's sort of like, well, you want to be yourself, but then the question is, well, who is that person, right? And the idea is that that person can be sort of framed in a certain way, that person can be looked at in a certain way, but ultimately, I think the test is, are your feelings sincere in any given moment, right? And, are you sort of planning out things with sincere feeling, and are you acting more for the self rather than for, in other words, like the self and the self's conception of what is the good, or what is sort of, what you believe in. That's something that you have to ask yourself. And if you're doing that, then I think that's a good test in terms of saying, am I truly acting like myself? Because I mean, obviously, I think one of the features of, obviously it's sort of like personality is, how influenceable we are, right? Like, how much, you get into a room with a bunch of guys, you're going to act tough, maybe, right? If you're tough guys, you're going to try to act tough. You get into a room with a bunch of, English women that are drinking tea, you might act very differently, right? And so the question, and if you are acting so differently, then the question is, sort of, are you still yourself, right? There's obviously this idea that, like, well, maybe that's yourself to be able to change, right? So I think it's a question that sort of regresses, but to me, one of the things, like I said, I think for me, like, there's an idea of honesty, right? And I try to do that. I think sometimes I'm not going to say I'm the most honest person. It's kind of ironic because I don't think I wouldn't claim to be the most honest person. But at the same time, I think there's a sort of genuineness that has to sort of come out of that. And so, like I said, that's interesting. And I think that it's interesting because, like I said, I had this nightmare last night where I was like, oh my gosh, like, good luck, like, to you, right? Who wants to be sort of genuine. And I don't mean that as an indictment on anything, not that it would be, coming from me, but I think it is interesting because there's sort of like, the person who is a certain way, I believe maybe perhaps has more difficulty, finding, he who beats, marches to the beat of his own drum needs to find a parade, right? Or needs to find a, something to march with. And so it's a very interesting question. This one other thing I'll say, because I guess we're going over 10 minutes now, but one other thing I'd say this video, the sort of, what am I going to say? The motivation to make this video was because I was listening to a sex podcast. Actually, boy, I'm really sharing my interest. No, I'm just kidding. It was I don't, like I said, I don't like to sort of like call out things when I name them, but I would say you can Google, like, I think it's like sex podcasts or like curiosity podcasts, etc. But anyway, so where was I going with that? No, but it's interesting because, we talk about sort of like the different lifestyles associated with sex, right? And, it's sort of like, oh, you're single, you're a bachelor, by choice. And then there's sort of like, oh, this idea of the opposite of that being like romantic, right? And I've always maintained that I'm a romantic of the hopeless variety. And so it's interesting because, you think about the term hopeless romantic, and there's something I've always thought I've never thought it was negative. I've never thought of the term hopeless romantic in a negative light. At the same time, there's something about being hopeless that's not very sort of comforting, right? So it's interesting. It is interesting because, you do wonder sort of, this idea of true love. And this is where it's funny because I think I started this with, we're going to try to get like pseudo deep. I think that's what I was going to talk about. And I talk about this other stuff, but I do think it's interesting. And I think that, to me, we talk about our conceptions of self, we talk about our conceptions of life, right? And, the idea that, you're going to want to, make sure you have descendants, right? I mean, I think that's always been sort of my MO, right? Like, being a male, I think males are probably more, I mean, stereotypically at least, right? They're more sort of sexually inclined. And I think it's part of it is that, there is this sort of, deep down inside, we want to sort of have sex with everything, right? To me, women, and I think I mentioned this already, like, to me, women are, women obviously are viewed upon more soft than others, and I don't necessarily think that's true. I think there's a certain cruelty that a woman can have that a man will never have. At least that's my opinion. I think men will punch you in the face, but a woman will poison you to death over time, and it's like, and so I think there's, it's, each gender, each sex has their superpowers, right? For sure. And so that's interesting. But I will say that I love women, right? Like, I really do love women, and I love to do nice things to them. So that's sort of what the thing. And I do believe, like, no matter how masculine you think of me, one of the reasons for that is sort of this drive to multiply myself, right? Saying the world needs multiple me's, but I think that this is it's interesting because, like, there's this sort of this idea that, like, one man, like, has sex with like 90% of the women, like the king has sex with like everybody, and like, you get a wife, but like make sure the king, like, fornicates with her first or something. It's interesting, but there is sort of this idea that, like, we want the best genes, and to me, that's got to be determined by the self, right? So, like, I have to, to find the women to mate with, and hopefully I can do that, because I do think there's something about, I think that's always a sort of brings life some depth, in my opinion. But I think I look at it from the perspective of being so raw. So that's always interesting, sort of how people's, how different perspectives look at it from different angles of existence, right? And that's something, and see, but these questions, right? This is sort of part of the rawness that I have, right? I'm always after these questions. So all of that to say, hope everybody's having a good first October. We're into October now. That was my main point, and so I just want to say that we made it this far. There's something about the idea that hopefully whatever spirit's within me, I can persevere, and I hope you, the viewer, are persevering as well. In your 2025, some archivist came upon these videos. They're like, who is this guy? What happened to him? I don't know. 2025, I said, that's 3 years from now. Maybe like 2055. I don't know. We're starting to think in the future, so we'll see. All right, have a good one, guys. Bye.